Hello friends, a couple of bits of housekeeping before diving into today's episode. The first is a little unfortunate, but I'm going to be dropping my release frequency to once a month for the next few months. Some big changes are happening in my life right now. I'll be moving abroad relatively soon, and I'm spending quite a bit of time working on a couple of courses in preparation for that. So all of that is to say, life is just a little hectic right now. I do want to emphasize my commitment to the show, however. The process of putting out this content has been massively rewarding for me, and all the more so for some of the heartwarming comments that I've heard from you. My intention is definitely to up the frequency once again in a few months' time. Some better news, though, is that I'm going to begin reaching out to people for interviews. Actually, part of the motivation for starting this thing up in the first place was as a ruse to lure brilliant minds into conversation with me. So I think now that we have 4 or 5 episodes under our belt, it's appropriate to start contacting people. To that end, if you have any requests for people that I should be trying to get on, or indeed if you're listening to this and have some ideas that you'd like to share yourself, please feel free to get in touch with me via email at kiana@willtowisdompod.com. My plan is to intersperse these interviews between the standard monologue format, so we should hopefully be getting back to 2 episodes per month once those interviews start rolling in. Alright, that's enough of that. Let's get into today's episode on Buddhist philosophy. Siddhartha Gautama, aka Buddha, lived at some point between the 6th and 4th centuries BC. Born into the ruling class, Siddhartha's early years were insulated from many of the cruel realities of life. However, at some point in his 20s, Siddhartha left his hometown of Lumbini in modern-day Nepal and became exposed to the horrific suffering that existed outside the palace walls. This experience had a profound effect on him. He resolved then to renounce his wealth and family and live the life of an ascetic. Siddhartha devoted himself to introspection and meditation and became enlightened. For the remaining years of his life, the Buddha spread his message, established orders of monks and nuns, and received the patronage of kings and merchants. Or so the legend goes. As you know, on this show, we're interested in ideas that can improve our understanding of the world we inhabit. Buddhist philosophy is packed full of them, and today, my friends, I'd like to share with you some of the core principles of Buddhist thought. My name's Kiana, and this is Will to Wisdom, a podcast exploring perspectives on living well. My personal interest in Buddhist philosophy stems from a relatively unusual place. I was drawn in primarily as a consequence of my interest in evolutionary psychology. One of evolutionary psychology's core claims is that our psyches aren't designed to accurately represent the world, but rather to propagate our genes into the next generation. This means that the existence in our minds of feelings of anxiety, depression, and suffering more generally are features, not bugs. They exist because they helped our ancestors survive. You might reasonably ask how suffering could possibly help anyone survive. Well, let's consider depression or long-term low mood, for example. We experience this kind of negative mental state when things just aren't working out in life. Maybe we've made some poor decisions, or a project we've worked hard on isn't getting off the ground. The reason depressed mental states exist, from an evolutionary perspective, is that they prompt us to give up unattainable goals and consider alternatives. They cause us to take a new path. Now, that doesn't mean that every instance of depression is productive, or that depressive tendencies can't misfire in people, causing severe bouts of long-term depression. It simply provides an explanation for why the neural pathways that cause depressed mental states exist in our minds in the first place. Evolutionary psychology demonstrates how selection shaped our brains and bodies to maximize reproduction at a massive cost to our happiness. It's remarkable how similar the Buddhist understanding of suffering is to the picture I just presented. As we'll see, Buddhist philosophy can in large part be understood as a study of suffering. For the Buddhists, like the modern-day evolutionary psychologists, the reason we suffer is that we don't see the world clearly. Our minds deceive us. On the Buddhist view, the most prominent way that our minds deceive us and therefore cause suffering is through our notion of self. As we'll see when we wade a bit deeper into Buddhist philosophy, the concept of anatman, or no self, is an important feature. For the Buddhists, the idea that we are the originators of all of our thoughts and decisions, or the instigators of all of our desires and aversions, is the primary cause of our suffering. This is because our notion of self creates a distorted view of reality. It represents us as selves at the center of our own universe, with everything else arrayed around us as objects of our existence. This leads us, in turn, to a view that it's rational to act in our own narrow self-interest. On the Buddhist view, our anxiety about the preservation and reputation of the self leads to greed, anger, fear, conflict, and general unhappiness. So, I became interested in evolutionary psychology because I was fascinated by its claim that our minds deceive us at a great cost to our happiness. Then I discovered that Buddhism makes a remarkably similar claim that the reason we suffer is because we don't see the world clearly. That connection caused me to try and understand Buddhism a little better as a philosophy for living. And today, I'd like to share with you some of its core principles. Nowadays, around the world, an estimated 500 million people identify as Buddhist. Most of these people are located in the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan, although we're seeing growing numbers in the West too. A good place for us to start our discussion of Buddhist philosophy is with the question of whether Buddhism is a religion. Now, clearly the answer will always come down to how we define a religion, so I'm not going to say categorically that it is or isn't, but some discussion of how Buddhism is similar to other religions and how it differs will be useful for us in understanding the core precepts of Buddhist thought. In many ways, Buddhism does resemble other religions. It has sacred texts, sacred places, a monastic order, various rituals, and so on. As well as this, Buddhism, like most other religions, has a defined philosophical underpinning. It has a metaphysics, a way of viewing and understanding the world. It has an epistemology, a theory of how we come to know things, and it also has an ethics, a theory of how we should live and how we should treat others. On the other hand, though, Buddhism majorly differs from other religions in that it contains no notion of God. For Buddhists, the universe operates through an endless cycle of birth and rebirth. As such, they assume that the universe has no ultimate beginning to it. It's always existed, and it will always exist. As a consequence of this cosmology, or lack thereof, I should say, there arose no need to posit a creator in the form of a deity. One of the more attractive things about this view is that with no notion of a supreme God, there can be no such thing as revealed truth. There are no concepts in Buddhism that must be believed because they're the word of God. This means that Buddhism as a faith is not as dogmatic in its teachings when compared to other faiths. That's not to say that Buddhist monks aren't expected to believe certain principles without questions. All religions are dogmatic to one extent or another, but you get what I mean. Now, Buddhism has seen a remarkable growth in popularity in the West over the last few decades. The correlation between Buddhism's rise in popularity and the decreasing number of people who express a belief in God is no great surprise. And it's demonstrable of the fact that many people find an atheistic worldview lacking in some important respect. Many atheists feel a spiritual void in their lives and so set about filling it through one means or another. For many, Buddhism has offered the spiritual outlet that they need in a godless world. Alright, so with that said, what do proponents of Buddhism actually believe? I should note that Buddhism has developed over time into a number of different traditions like Mahayana to Vajrayana, each with various sects like Zen and Tibetan Pure Land and so on. Each of these traditions and sects vary in their interpretation of the teachings of the Buddha. However, certain core principles are shared amongst all the traditions, and those are what we're going to focus on today. Back to the Buddhist notion of self. As we mentioned, one of the fundamental features of Buddhist philosophy is the denial of any notion of self. But before denying something, we first need to define it. So, by the self, the Buddhist means the part of you that's constant throughout the course of your life and which defines you as you. The Buddhist position is that there is no such thing. The famous ship of Theseus paradox is instructive here. Imagine a ship that has each of its planks replaced one by one as they go rotten. Over time, every original plank on the ship is replaced with a brand new one. When none of the original planks remain, is it the same ship? The only possible answer is that since no part of the original structure exists, it cannot be said to be the same ship. There's no part of it that has continuity. The Buddhist idea is that a human being is no different. We're under a constant state of change, and there's no unchanging part in us within which the self can be said to reside. Our connection to a sense of self on this view is only a matter of convention. I call myself Kiana so that I'm able to interact with the world, so I can maintain relationships and order coffee at Starbucks, but really the notion that I'm a continuous entity that directs my thoughts and actions like a little CEO between my ears is illusory according to the Buddhists. And as we'll see, it's more than just a useful illusion. Our notion of self is actually the greatest source of our suffering too. But before getting onto that, I want to briefly mention the remarkable similarity between many of these ideas and modern views in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. Dan Dennett, for example, describes very convincingly the illusory nature of the self. This is from a 2003 paper of his. Quote, "It seems to us as if each of us is a self, a unified rational agent in control of a body. I'm in charge of my body, and you're in charge of yours." Descartes, in the 17th century, famously called this agent in charge a res cognitans, a thinking thing, and deduced to his own satisfaction that it could not be a physical or mechanical thing, but rather an immaterial thing, which he could conveniently identify with his immortal soul. Today, materialism has swept dualism and its insoluble mysteries of interaction aside, and this is no longer regarded as a convenient or even tenable hypothesis. End quote. This materialism that Dennett mentions refers to the most prominent view in cognitive science and philosophy of mind today. Materialism sees all consciousness as a simple byproduct of purely physical processes in the brain and nervous system. There's no non-physical center in which a self or a true immaterial soul can reside on this view. Dennett goes on, quote, "Efforts to identify the self with a particular subsystem in the brain run into snags at every turn. I call this the fallacy of the Cartesian theater, the place in the brain where it all comes together for conscious appreciation and decision. This just cannot be right. All of the work done by the imagined homunculus in the Cartesian theater must be distributed around to the lesser agencies in the brain. But some people just hate this idea. They think mistakenly that unless there's a Cartesian theater, there's no consciousness. They're wrong for many reasons, not least of which that the specs for such an organ or faculty in the body turn out to be, shall we say, optimistic." End quote. This is now the prevailing view amongst cognitive scientists. The Cartesian view that there are two substances in the world, mental and physical, is no longer accepted. And if we are purely physical and in a constant state of change, then where can the continuous self be said to reside? Now you might think, okay, I can accept that it's possible to come to this conclusion through scientific experiments, detailed anatomy of the brain and fMRI scans and so on, but how the hell did the Buddha figure this stuff out 2,500 years ago? The Buddhist answer to this is that through the practice of meditation, of observing your thoughts and mental states as they arise, you'll experience the transient nature of our sense of self. Indeed, this is the entire point of meditation. By examining the contents of your mind directly, it becomes obvious that we're not the originators of our thoughts and sensations and emotions. This insight, as we'll see, has the power to alleviate a great deal of suffering. Samsara, the endless cycle of rebirth and death. The Buddha, following his life of contemplation and meditation, passed on three so-called universal truths. The first we've seen already, Anatman, that there's no eternal unchanging soul or self, just a collection of changing characteristics and attributes. The second is Anicca. Anicca is most often translated to impermanence. The Buddhists see everything in nature as subject to a constant state of change. As the seasons change, leaves change color and fall, bringing new looks and new life. Even great geological formations morph and change over time. Human beings are subject to impermanence as well, not only over the course of an entire life, but within every phase of life too. We grow out of childhood into adulthood and finally into old age, and each phase of life brings with it its own set of joys and challenges. On an even finer-grained level, our emotional states are subject to impermanence too. Although when we suffer, it's difficult to take a step back and recognize that the pain will pass, when we're able to make that observation, it can be quite cathartic. But equally, we must also recognize the impermanence of our moments of pleasure too. These too will pass according to Samsara. Because everything is subject to a constant state of change, we must recognize that we'll never be able to achieve a constant state of happiness. Things will inevitably happen in life that will make us happy, but they'll always be impermanent, and at some point or another, that happiness will be replaced by suffering. So, for the Buddhists, the common goal that many self-help kind of thinkers aspire to reach a constant state of happiness, is fallacious. No one can aspire to constant happiness because nothing in the universe is constant. And this brings us on to the Buddha's third universal truth, dukkha. Now, dukkha is most constantly translated to suffering, but really is much more all-encompassing than that. The better English word to use to describe it is unsatisfactoriness. It describes the true nature of our existence. Our lives will always contain some amount of unsatisfactoriness. Recognition of the fact of dukkha as one of the three basic characteristics of existence, along with impermanence and the absence of a self, constitutes right knowledge. The Buddha distinguishes three types of suffering: that which results respectively from pain, sickness, and death, from pleasure changing to pain, and from the fact that because of impermanence, beings are susceptible to pain in the next moment. As we said, to achieve a state of constant happiness is an impossible task. We'll always fall short of this aim. However, Buddhism does offer a path for reducing our suffering. Though dukkha will always be present in our lives to some extent or another, by first recognizing certain truths about our existence, then by following a certain set of principles, we'll be in a position to reduce our own burden of pain as well as the burden of others. Buddhism is not about being happy. It's about minimizing suffering. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths are derived from his investigations into the nature of suffering. The first truth, which we've touched on already, is that dukkha is a common and universal feature of existence. Suffering is an inevitable fact of life. The second truth is samudaya, that there is a cause to suffering. For the Buddhist, suffering is born out of attachment. We become attached to certain people, places, objects, and mental states. These attachments then form our desires. Desires come in all sorts of shapes and sizes: sensual pleasures, material objects, fame, the avoidance of unpleasant sensations, and so on. When our desires are unfulfilled, we suffer. The third noble truth is nirodha, that there is an end to suffering. For the Buddhists, to end suffering, all attachments must be overcome. Indeed, liberation from the suffering that's caused by our attachment is the ultimate end of Buddhism. This liberation is referred to as nirvana and describes the condition under which the mind experiences complete freedom from the self and all of its attachments by letting go of all desires and cravings. The final noble truth is magga, that nirvana can be achieved by following the Eightfold Path. This path, referred to as Astangika Marga, is an early formulation of the path to enlightenment. The idea of the Eightfold Path appears in what is regarded as the first sermon of the Buddha, which he delivered after his enlightenment. There he sets forth a middle way, the Eightfold Path between the extremes of asceticism and sensual indulgence. Like the Four Noble Truths, the term Astangika Marga also implies nobility, and is often translated as the Eightfold Noble Path. Similarly, just as what's noble about the Four Noble Truths is not the truths themselves, but those who understand them, what is noble about the Eightfold Path is not the path itself, but those who follow it. So, what does the path consist in? The 8 principles can be split into 3 categories. The first is panna, which means wisdom or discernment. The second is sila, meaning virtue or morality, and the third is samadhi, concentration or meditation. We'll discuss each of these categories in turn. The first of the 2 principles that make up panna is right understanding. This is the very first step on the path to nirvana, and it requires us to see the world as it really is, not as we desire or expect it to be. Specifically, it requires an acceptance and an understanding of the view that dukkha is an unavoidable part of life, and that our suffering comes as a consequence of attachments which stem from our inflated notion of self. As the Buddha notes, quote, "I must state clearly that my teaching is a method to experience reality and not reality itself, just as a finger pointing to the moon is not the moon itself. A thinking person makes use of the finger to see the moon. A person who only looks at the finger and mistakes it for the moon will never see the real moon." End quote. The second principle of panna is commonly translated to right intent. This is the step where we become committed to the path. Right understanding shows us what life really is and what life's problems are composed of, and right intent urges us to commit to the path. It requires us to recognize all suffering as equal and to make our intent in life to minimize it for ourselves and others. The metaphor that we can use to explain right intent is climbing a mountain. Before the climb, it's necessary to prepare by plotting the route, by checking equipment, and by waiting for perfect conditions. These steps amount to right understanding of the mountain. But you'll never complete the climb with right understanding alone. You also need right intent. You need to have a real desire to reach the top. And so too with achieving nirvana and freeing oneself from our desires and attachments, which ultimately cause us to suffer. So those are the 2 elements of the Eightfold Path that make up wisdom and discernment. Now we come on to sila. If you recall, sila refers to the elements of the Eightfold Path that relate to virtue and morality. The first principle relating to sila is right speech. For the Buddhists, the words we choose have a powerful effect on the world around us. Therefore, they ought to be chosen mindfully. Right speech in this context means abstention from a number of things. Firstly, from telling lies. Second, from slander and any talk that may bring about hatred, enmity, disunity, and disharmony amongst individuals or groups of people. And finally, abstention from idle babble and gossip. The aim of the Noble Path is to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. Since our words can be a primary source of suffering, the Buddhists emphasize the importance of thinking before we speak. One of my favorite practical ideas from Buddhist philosophy is the concept of noble silence. Simply put, if we have nothing of benefit to say, then it's better to say nothing at all. So that's right speech. Next, we come on to right action. Clearly, good thoughts and wholesome speech alone won't produce a virtuous person. They also need to perform moral actions too. To that end, Buddhism forbids a few specific actions. Killing of any kind is off the cards, as is stealing and sexual misconduct. Whilst it's obvious how refraining from these acts would reduce the level of external suffering in the world, an important thing to note is that all of the elements of the path are also intended to reduce personal suffering too. It's important to moderate our thoughts, speech, and actions because these are the precise things which cause our own suffering. When we get into negative thought patterns, we start to feel depressed, often with no perceivable external cause. When we say something to somebody that we regret later, or when we behave in a way towards someone that isn't right, we feel guilt. So, right speech, right action, and all the other elements of the Eightfold Path are important not only because of their effect on others' suffering, but also on our own. Okay, on to step 5 of the Eightfold Path, right livelihood. Simply put, don't pursue any work that causes suffering in the world. If your work helps people in some way, then you're achieving right livelihood. If you're working for a company that produces its products by using child labor, or one that produces environmental damage without cleaning it up, or sells weapons to bad actors, etc., then you're pursuing wrong livelihood and contributing to the world's suffering. So there we have the 3 elements of the Eightfold Path that make up Sila. Now we move on to the final 3 steps of the path that contribute to samadhi, concentration or meditation. The first element here is right effort. To do anything in life requires determination, persistence, and energy. Right effort includes cultivating good habits, such as practicing mindfulness, meditation, and other positive moral acts in our daily lives, not just from time to time. Quote, "Here the monk arouses his will, puts forth effort, generates energy, exerts his mind, and strives to prevent the arising of evil and unwholesome mental states that have not yet arisen. And he arouses his will, puts forth effort, generates energy, exerts his mind, and strives to maintain wholesome mental states that have already arisen, to keep them free of delusion, to develop, increase, cultivate, and perfect them. This is called right effort." End quote. Next, we have right mindfulness. This involves becoming aware of our body, mind, and emotions. Practicing right mindfulness is to focus our attention on our body and mind in such a way as to recognize our cravings, hatred, and ignorance as simple features of our consciousness that arise and diminish without our direct control. By observing these mental states for what they are, simple features of consciousness, then with time and practice, we'll be able to minimize the suffering that those states cause. But how do we actually observe these states? Well, that question brings us on to the final element of the Eightfold Path, right concentration. As we know, meditation is an important feature of Buddhist teachings. But what really is the point of meditating? What can we hope to achieve by doing it? Well, the aim of meditation is to allow us to enter a state of open, non-judgmental attention to the contents of consciousness. One thing that happens when you start meditating is that you realize how easy it is to become distracted and lose focus on a task as simple as observing the breath. I could hardly manage 3 breaths before my mind started wandering. You also realize that you're not the originator of these distractions. They just happen without any influence from you. Meditation is a technique for breaking the constant state of distraction that we exist in. The goal is to snap ourselves out of our endless stream of consciousness, if only for a moment. Doing so, in the end, will help us to break the habit of ceaselessly grasping at the pleasant and recoiling from the unpleasant. It allows us to recognize our desires for what they are, simple features of consciousness that we have no power to affect. This, in turn, means that we can enjoy a state of existence that's undisturbed by worry and effortlessly aware of the flow of experience in the present. Now, like with anything, getting to that state is not easy. Monks dedicate their lives to achieving precisely that, and I'm sure that many monks still lead lives in which worry is a common feature. But just slowing down for a few moments every day to observe your thoughts for what they are will help you to put your negative emotion in its proper place, and to recognize that negative emotion and suffering in general are unavoidable facts of life, and through that realization, perhaps minimize their negative consequences. And so there you have every step on the Noble Eightfold Path. Right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And I think we'll wrap up this very brief introduction to the core tenets of Buddhist philosophy there. We've spoken about the Buddhist view of self, the endless cycle of rebirth and death, the Four Noble Truths, and the Noble Eightfold Path. Really though, we've barely scratched the surface, and there are many varieties of Buddhist thinking that I've left out the discussion completely. If you're interested in learning more, then head over to the transcript of this episode at willtowisdompod.com. There you'll be able to find some links to further reading. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts about the show. You can get in touch with your suggestions, criticisms, and topics you'd like to see discussed in the future via email at kiana@willtowisdompod.com. That's Keyana. If you enjoy the show and are listening on Apple Podcasts, go ahead and leave a rating or a review. This really helps the algorithm present the show to others. With that, all that's left to do is to thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.